Okay, I can see the numbers building now, so I think we're probably in a place where we can get started. So again, thank you for joining. This is the From Specification to Carbon webinar. So in a few moments, I'm going to hand over to Rob Charlton, CEO of Space Architects, who's going to take you through the majority of this webinar. But just before we start proper, there's a little bit of housekeeping to cover off. So I'm just going to do that now, and then I'm going to hand over to Rob. So the session is being recorded, so a copy of it will be sent round to watch back, whether you're joining us live now or whether you're watching it back later. There is a Q&A function. It's a panel to the side of your screen. I think on your screen it'll be on the right-hand side. It's going to be made live in the next couple of minutes. So pop your questions in there as we go. Don't leave them all to the end. And then we'll cover them all after Rob's gone through his presentation. So that's it, very short bit of housekeeping. I'm going to hand over to Rob now. Enjoy the rest of the webinar, and I'll be back later with the Q&A. Okay, thanks. Rob, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to see that there's so many of you come along, which is always a good sign and a bit of a motivator. So today's talk is about what's keeping architects awake at night, which is quite an interesting title. And obviously, this is my view as an architect. What's certainly keeping me awake at night, and what I hear from colleagues is keeping them awake at night. First of all, just give you a little bit of background to who Space Group are, because BIMSTO are part of Space Group, and it's relevant to this conversation. So Space Group is about connecting information to improve project outcomes. And the story goes back right the way to 1957, when Space Architects was set up as a partnership, originally called Waring and Nets Partnership, and then 20 years ago became Space Architects. Very much where the digital journey started, and we were one of the first companies to use parametric software. We chose Revit. And we found over a number of years that a lot of our clients were really interested in this and wanted to know more. So that's when we set up in 2010, we set up BIM Technologies, which is a digital consultancy, very successful and working in London with some amazing clients. We've just finished off the Google building. We work with people like Berkeley, Barrett's, lots of great clients. Then a similar time around 2010, we realized that if we were creating these fantastic models, we needed components to put into them. And we felt that it was important to put manufacturer-specific components in rather than generic. So we decided that BIMSTO would be a good methodology, and that's a library for sharing digital components. And again, still going strong, base in the UK and a base in Australia, and has millions of downloads and hundreds of thousands of users every day. And then to come up right up to date, about 5 years ago, we realized we had these fantastic models, and there's a lot of energy and effort going into them, but actually they weren't being used beyond handover of the project. So some of our clients were saying, what do we do with these models? So we started developing TwinView, which initially, in its starting point, was a digital viewer. And then it became a digital twin when we added facilities management. We connected in all of the IoT. So that's our story. And it is relevant to today, because you'll see how the importance of digital information is, and how we track that through the design and operational process. So yeah, this is me. I'm Rob Charlton. I'm the Chief Executive of Space Group, and as I mentioned earlier, I am an architect by profession. Less so involved on the day-to-day of architecture, but still very much involved in things like design reviews, and I still work with the team in seeing what is happening in the industry. My role with the team is around looking to the future, seeing what's coming down the line and what's impacting on our industry day to day. So this is me nearly 30 years ago. You'll see the impact that 30 years in the construction industry has had on me. A little bit greyer, a few stone heavier, and a little bit less hair. But still enjoying it, I have to say. I still love being an architect, I still love what I do. I still love messing around with buildings. So I feel I'm very blessed from that point of view. But what I thought would be helpful to start is where my journey started and where how I started out as an architect and what I used to do day to day, because my career isn't massively long. It's sort of 25, 30 years. And in that stage, that time, I've seen huge changes. So I started out on the drawing board, and I do, there's quite a few people, young people in our business who haven't got a clue what a drawing board is. So we actually have to have one in the office just to remind everyone. And depending on the audience today, who I can't see in the age group, that some of you will know what these objects are and some of you won't have a clue. The pen on the right hand side is a rotring pen, and that's a 0.35. And if you've been in the industry a while, you would be able to tell that was a 0.35 from the yellow the yellow piece of plastic around the middle. Then the other bit on the right hand bottom right is what some younger people might think is drafting tape or masking tape that you use for painting against. In my day, this is what held your drawing to the drawing board. And then probably the most important tool that we have, some people might say that's a razor blade. In my day, that was the delete button, and we would scratch out the lines that maybe we didn't want to be there. But it was a very different world. Things moved a lot slower. And then what happened to us is we saw the parametric software where if we moved a door, it updated the plans, sections, elevations. And in the past, if I'd moved a door in an analog world, I would have had to update lots of drawings and maybe missed a one, which would then cause a problem on site. So it's quite a journey we've had in our industry, and while sometimes we beat ourselves up that we've got things wrong, but we also have made a huge amount of progress in the last 25 years, which is something to be very pleased about. But in that time, there have been huge changes and challenges for us as an industry and for society as a whole. Things have changed hugely. And I think one of the biggest ones is the digitization of the industry, as I mentioned earlier. Left-hand side, again, for the younger people who are listening, that's a television that was around back in the day when I was growing up. But if you look at where the industry's come from, on the left-hand side is sort of where we were in the 90s, and we've made a move as an industry to Netflix. So we've made this huge jump from a very analog world to a digital world in a relatively short space of time. We're very much in the Netflix world now. But then I thought it'd be worth just reflecting on, again, how my life and career was. I started out in paper. So this was on the left-hand side, the architect's job book was the Bible. That was, you can see the 5th edition was 1988. But again, it was in a file. And then on the right-hand side is what is the NBS. And when I used to write a specification, we used to have markups, and I would fill in the markups on a piece of paper. And then I would, because NBS is a Northeast company, I would take my markup down to the NBS office, and it would be typed up for me from my markups, and then I would go back and pick it up. See, things have changed a little bit from then. Another big element of the industry is changes in procurement, and I think this is probably the most impactful issue in the industry. Back in the day, we would always work on traditional procurement, where the design team designed a set of requirements, and then the contractor would price them and then build them. From a client's point of view, that was putting an awful lot of risk. An awful lot of risk on them. So that's when the design and build contractual form came out. So early 2000s, that really started to build momentum. And now probably 95% of projects in our office are design and build. And then what's happened with that is there's a whole story and a whole other webinar about the move from traditional to design and build and the impact. But a lot of that has been around transferring risk, some for the right reasons, some for less reasons around commerciality. But often everything gets pushed down to the subcontractor, and a lot of responsibility sits with the subcontractor. And one of the challenges of design and build, sometimes the people that are doing the specification and design work, maybe not the right people to do it. And the drivers are different. They may be on cost rather than on performance. So this is all driven to something I call the design and build chasm. What we will find is that often we start building buildings before the design's finished, and that causes huge problems, and people from outside the industry can't believe we do this. And I'm sort of being kind here to say we start on site when in the middle of stage 4, but often I've seen it where stage 3 isn't even finished, and off we go building it. So that's caused a huge amount of problems in the industry. Still happens today, but we'll see some of the outcomes of that as we go through the presentation further. And I think what we're trying to do as an industry is trying to reduce that gap and make it more efficient. And again, we'll talk about that in gateways as we get through the presentation. So the all important thing, the bit that you're all really waiting for and getting, finding out what's keeping architects awake at night. Well, these are the three things. These are three things that I believe are right at the forefront of architects' minds at the moment. Firstly, the issues of fire and around Grenfell, and that's very much something that's driving a lot of architects and their decisions and their concerns. The next one is principal designer, but particularly principal designer building regs, because that has put an awful lot of responsibility onto the architect. And then last but not least is the whole issue around global warming and the impact of carbon. So those are the three things, and I'm going to talk through each of those and give a little bit more detail and context around each of those. But firstly, why are they so important? And they kind of merge over. But professional indemnity insurance is one of the big challenges that architects face, which is around risk. And the risk now on architects is significant. Just to give an idea, in the last 5 years, our PI has gone up 95%, and there's reports of some smaller practices where it's gone up to 1,500%. So not only is the risk there, there's a financial burden, and now PI has become a significant line on a profit and loss account, and often back in straight after the Grenfell disaster, some practices were struggling to get insurance at all. The middle one around PD, the big thing now is that if we get the PD thing wrong, the architect or the principal designer, if the architect is the principal designer, is going to prison as the accountable person. If they get that wrong, it's now it's not the company, it's not corporate manslaughter anymore, it's now the individual. So it'll be Rob Charlton is named as the principal designer, and if something goes wrong on that project and I'm found to be incompetent or I've deliberately overlooked something, I'm going to prison. And then the final thing is around the emerging generations, particularly Generation Z, very, very different. I'm a Generation X, and one of my biggest challenges is to try and get my head around how Generation Zs think, not least my daughter's a Generation Z as well. So they are very different, certainly to Generation X. And one of their big drivers, and we certainly see this in recruitment, very different drivers. The environment is important to them. They're very purpose-driven. And that does have an impact on how we operate day to day. Interestingly, from a recruitment point of view, when we are recruiting Generation Zs, it is a genuine reason for them to select an organisation to work for, how you are, if you're purpose driven, what your values are. So that does change things in the team that you're building. So the first issue is around fire, as we talked about. This probably might be quite obvious to everyone, but obviously the Grenfell disaster over the last 5 years has had a huge impact on all of us, right across the industry. And unfortunately, the industry, the finger very much got pointed at the industry in the inquiry, and we didn't come out very well from this disaster. Unfortunately, 72 people lost their lives due to that. So the why, and why is this important, and why is it keeping architects awake? if you want a little bit more detail and understand, and you are feeling robust, because none of these things are particularly easy reads or watches. So a good book to read is a book by Peter Apps, who has been heavily involved in the inquiry and understanding it and being involved in that. His book, Show Me the Bodies, How We Let Grenfell Happen, is a great view on it. It is a tough read, because what it does, it talks about where things went wrong, but also then in between that, it talks about the impact on the people as you go through the book. And then right up to date, the Grenfell Uncovered program on Netflix came out in June. And again, not an easy watch, but it does bring out some new information that wasn't known before. And particularly that's around Arconic, who I believe have got off lightly. Many other manufacturers have had a really tough time and have been interrogated. But this is personal opinion. I would say the Arconic specification and the issues they did is the major factor in the Grenfell disaster, up to about, so again, slightly controversial, but I would say 90%. If the Arconic product hadn't been on that building, clearly this is unlikely to have happened. And at the moment, it's an American company, the subsidiaries in France, and at the moment, so they didn't come to the inquiry because they didn't have to, because of not being a British company. But they've got off relatively lightly up to now, but I think that's going to change, and some of the emails that were found by those creating the film are fairly damning on them. So all that's led to a very important change in legislation through the Building Safety Act. And again, I'll talk a little bit more around that. But I know a lot of the people on the call are construction product manufacturers, so particularly relevant to them. But the world for construction manufacturers, construction product manufacturers has changed. So now their legislation and requirements all sits within the Office of Project Safety and Standards, and they are the UK regulator for construction products and have a very important role. They're funded by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and they are responsible for policy. There's an interesting shift, which again I might touch upon later, but the Building Safety Regulator had sat within the HSE up until about 2 weeks ago. You may have seen a lot of the issues on the television around gateways and how projects were being delayed. And Angela Rayner got involved. Obviously, the current government have got to set themselves quite a high challenge to get new housing built over the next Parliament. But the new Building Safety Regulator was struggling to approve the buildings and the approvals at Gateway 2. So the government got involved, and strangely, about 2 weeks ago, the head of the Building Safety Regulator retired, and then the following week, the Building Safety Regulator was moved out of the Health and Safety Department and moved directly into the MHCLG with direct links to the Secretary of State. So it's been given a far higher profile. What I'm not sure about is whether or not the OPSS has moved as well. I'm not sure about that. I can't find any information. But what it does say is that how this is moving up the priority level, certainly for this government. So they took on the role in 2021, and their role is about protecting the public. That's how it's seen at the highest level, but also to educate and inform industry and make sure that the regulations are appropriate, and they make sure that the industry complies with all of the standards. So it's a major requirement for product manufacturers. There's a little bit of other history around what's going on with products, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, but some of you may not be. And I was at the installer show a couple of weeks ago, and I was sort of testing the water there, and there was a incredible amount of people had no awareness of any of this. Now maybe other people in the organisation did, but I believe this is fundamental for the industry, and slightly concerning, the lack of awareness. I'd probably say it was about 95% of people had no idea about any of this. So one of the reports, which was completed in April 23, was completed by Paul Morell and Annalise Day. Paul Morell used to work for Davis Langdon and is really well respected in the industry. And his brief was to look at the testing of construction products across the industry. And without going into the detail, I think he quite simply said it wasn't fit for purpose. It is a huge document. I have to admit, I haven't read all of it. It is very dry, but ultimately the outcome was that basically the testing regime is effectively all over the place and inconsistent. And he made a number of recommendations to address that. Probably one of the most important things at the moment, and again, my research in the installer show demonstrated that absolutely nobody knew anything about this. As I say, I'm sure others in their organisation do, but this is certainly at the moment one of the most important documents for those in the industry. February 2025, it was launched, and the government, this is the government setting out their thinking for how construction products would be managed going forward. The consultation paper that closed in May, so if you had some thoughts, you've missed your chance, and it is quite impactful. So it really does expand the regulatory scope, so it very much puts it under government responsibility. It does propose a new statutory regulator, sets out the safety duties for any construction products, and very much around making sure that there's transparency, traceability, and information. It's proposing a construction library, and not necessarily proposing digital product passports, but did mention them and suggested they may be something to look at. There's the sustainability is a big part of it as well, and putting requirements in on there. And then one of the big things at the bottom is the sort of redress to any manufacturer that doesn't comply with the construction product requirements. So what happens with the green paper, for those who don't know it, it then becomes, this is the government saying these are the things we're thinking about. The industry makes its comments, and then that becomes a white paper. Again, it goes to the next level, because that then sets out what they're thinking about from a legislation point of view, and then ultimately that could become legislation. Now, it's not a slow process, not a quick process. It takes time, but clearly there's changes afoot. So from a designer's point of view, we are seeing the idea of certification and test data is absolutely essential to us now. For us, that gives us a level of comfort. I have to say, the BBA, again, when I was coming through the ranks, having a BBA certificate in the library gave me a lot of comfort. But in the inquiry, the inquiry was pretty damning of BBA in their testing regime. And also in recent years, I've worked out, I've understood how people are getting around some of the certification. So maybe it's not as robust as it was before, but still having it is better than nothing. And then the code for construction product information. This is not meant to be a pitch for them, but certainly when I've looked into it more, it seems like a good approach. It very much gets into the culture of the organisation, not just the product. So we as architects are looking for this type of thing. And again, I'll touch upon a little bit later that we generally don't specify without certification now, and we're quite robust about it. So the second one is the principal designer role, and this is really specific for architects. Comes out of the Building Safety Act, and as I said earlier, it really is a personal responsibility. So individuals are very aware of it, and really the principal designer must have a certain level of experience. There's no one in our organisation would be a principal designer if they haven't got at least 10 years experience, and ideally 15. So you need to have a lot of years behind you. So what is the Building Safety Regulator? So starting at the top, the Building Safety Regulator was set up as part of the Building Safety Act back in 2022. And their role is to regulate the higher risk buildings, which are buildings above 18 metres, and making sure the construction of them is done in a safe way. Generally across the board, raising safety standards, and then help professionals in design, construction and building control to improve their competence. So when the Building Safety Act came out, it didn't really mention the principal designer in any level of detail. Basically what it said is it's down to the Building Safety Regulator to decide how they want to take those roles forward and sort out the regulation. But then in the building regs, so under the Building Safety Regulator sits the building regulations, and they, in the building regulations documentation, they set out the role of a principal designer. And over the last year or so, you'd have probably heard lots and lots of debate and discussion about what a principal designer's role is. It's fairly simple for me, and I just always say go back to the legislation. But in simple terms, what the principal designer role is to make sure that anything that is designed complies with all standards that are available if built. So that means that the principal designer is responsible for everything, the construction information that then is passed to the constructor to build. So for example, if a constructor changes the specification, that's the constructor's responsibility. But if the specification is on the drawings, it's down to the principal designer. So the other big thing for the Building Safety Act gives clear accountability. So which is great. I believe it's been the issues of the clouding between those roles, and if you followed the implications or what happened at the Grenfell disaster, it was very much around the blurring of responsibilities, and it felt like nobody would take any took responsibility for anything, and ultimately that's what caused the disaster. But now you've got accountable people, and these are all now broken down into individual silos. So the client is responsible for setting the project up and making sure they pick the right people. Principal designer is solely responsible for design. The principal contractor is solely responsible for construction. And then ultimately, once we get to a handed over building, the client is responsible for operating the building in a safe way for the residents in their buildings. And why does that all matter? Because the duty holders and accountable people, if you get it wrong, you're going to prison. And that's obviously a great incentive for people. Obviously, these standards and regulations weren't around in the Grenfell disaster, but my view is that people will be going to prison due to corporate manslaughter. But it's probably going to take years to get to that point. But I think ultimately that will happen. So again, it's simple. You saw the previous slide where I talked about the design, the D&B chasm. What's great now is the Building Safety Act very clearly sets out who's responsible for what part. So the client has to set the requirements out very clearly. The principal designer now is responsible for 1 to 4. So why that's relevant in particular is that if a designer is being pressured by a contractor on a design and build to change a specification, for example, change the plasterboard, we are now in a position to say no. Whereas in the past, it might have been a commercial decision, and we do this in our organisation. If a contractor comes to us and says, we want to change to this plasterboard because it's cheaper, we'll say that's okay, but we'll have to go away and check the specification, and if it is appropriate, we will change them, but you will be paying for it. And now, because we've got the legislation behind us, I think everyone in the industry accepts that, and it has to be the way. Then the contractor is responsible for stage 5 and stage 6. So it's really nice and clean. The responsibilities are clearly set. Sometimes there's grey areas around it, but ultimately it's down to those accountable people to manage that process. The other thing you might have heard about over the last year or so, and I mentioned it earlier, is the gateways. So this is particularly for a higher risk building, and at the moment, high risk building is defined, without going into lots of detail, is defined as a building over 18 metres. So Gateway 1, all of these gateways have to be approved, and the building safety regulator has to approve 2 and 3. Gateway 1 effectively is planning, and to be honest, most competent designers would be doing most of the things in there. It's about making sure that the fire tender can get access and all that sort of thing at planning stage. And where it gets interesting is Gateway 2, and there's not many projects being approved. It literally is a handful of projects being approved at Gateway 2, which is why the Secretary of State got involved. And there's lots of reasons for that. One, I think the industry has struggled to understand what a Gateway 2 requires, and I think a lot of people in our industry, from a designer's point of view, don't necessarily have an understanding of the level of detail that's needed. But also the building safety regulator was swamped, which means there's a real bottleneck to get through. But if you do get through Gateway 2, you then go to Gateway 3, and Gateway 3 is getting a completion certificate when the project is handed over, and the client cannot occupy the building until they've got a completion certificate. So imagine they are really hard stops in the industry, which probably have been a bit greyer before, so causing challenges. But there is a lot of discussion and debate around what should be provided. But my view is it's very simple. It's very clearly the RIBA plan of work is an excellent document used right across the industry, and clearly sets out what is required at what stage. So I will say to people, if in doubt, look at the RIBA plan of work. It'll tell you what you should be doing. Everything for stage 4 should be finished at stage 4, which means that's Gateway 2. And then just to touch upon, I thought I'd touch briefly upon the golden thread. So there is a golden thread required, which is a digital requirement of critical information through the development of a high-risk building in particular, but also in all non-high-risk buildings, the same requirement is there. So you can see there, the golden thread is a single source of truth encompassing all aspects of its design, construction, and ongoing maintenance. And as we all know in the industry, there's lots of information gets lost throughout the design and operation of buildings. Anybody that operates a building will know that the critical information goes missing. So this kind of aligns in a lot with what Space Group's about, is how we develop information and maintain information throughout the process. So you can see it goes right the way through the life cycle. So just to demonstrate this, I thought briefly I would just take a quick view of the life of a BIM valve, which often, particularly for product manufacturers, you might not realize how important your data is in the life cycle of a project and in the operation, and how that data, the investment that you make in BIM objects, is absolutely critical to the golden thread. So we'll take a humble valve. A lot of our clients in BIM Store do host their valves on BIM Store, and actually probably one of the most downloaded products that we have. But the first thing an architect will do, or an engineer, will download the product. But they'll want to know that it's that it complies. That's one of our biggest concerns. Hence why this is not meant necessarily to be a pitch for BIM Store. But the reason we made BIM Store that they had to be manufacturer approved is that now it's so important to specify, is because they're ultimately taking the responsibility. So the data in there is absolutely essential. So you'll see the engineer or the designer is selecting what's in there. So this is all the data that is put in by manufacturers via someone like BIM Store. But all the documentation comes with that, and probably importantly, you see there products, certificates, the data sheets. All of that is absolutely essential, and you'll see how that pops up at the end of the process. So you have, all of this data is absolutely essential at the starting point. This is right at the beginning of the project. This is Revit. So this is where that object is then dropped into the Revit authoring software by the designer, and you can see it in the system there, sitting, but not only sitting there with its geometry, sitting there with all of its data. And you can see this level of detail is in the model, and then all of that data that was put in the object at the beginning is still there in that Revit model. And then why that's relevant is you'll have seen twin view. So that information that you've put all that time and energy and effort into, making sure the certification's right, ends up in a platform, a digital twin platform like TwinView, and is used now for many years ahead. So all of that data then is still in something like TwinView. All of those documents that we looked at before are still there in TwinView and are used in operation. So you see there why the golden thread is so essential going forward. And not only do we have just the data, but there's the whole operational side, how things were constructed. So basically now what we need to do by law is making sure that we have accurate data. And again, the accountable person for that is the client, so that during operation, the client can put their hands on all of the information that they need to about how that building is safe. And I thought I'd just pick up on a few implications of all of this from a day-to-day point of view. So from a practical point of view, as an architect, we will only specify a particular manufacturer. So for example, other manufacturers are available. Say we specified British gypsum, we wouldn't specify 15mm plasterboard anymore. We would now specify 15mm British gypsum Duraline board. The reason for that is that we would have the certification, but not just we actually don't need the certification of the board, we need the certification of the system. British Gypsum are very clear about this. They have their white book and all of their details, and they will stand by all of that information. So on that basis, we will specify. If there's non-standard details, that's where it starts to get challenging, because they may not have certification. But how we handle that is that if we have such things, we get a number of experienced technologists and we make what we would say our informed decision. So anything did happen in the future, we'd gone through with lots of experience that we had thought about it and given it due consideration, and we have reasons for that. So again, that's a change where in the past we might have just said plasterboard. Now we have to specify. If the contractor wants to change it, we'll say yes, but we need to check all of the specification again, and that is non-negotiable. So it's not if the contractor wants to change it without our input, or does change it, that's their responsibility. You'd expect cladding to be in there after all the challenges at Grenfell, but the big thing there is we're no longer looking for certification of just the panel, we're looking for certification of the system. So we need to know that the framing works, the insulation works with it. So we need to look at the certification for the whole system. I also think people are very nervous, clients are very nervous. When we're designing things, clients just don't like the word cladding on their buildings. So it's a good message for those that provide bricks, but for cladding manufacturers, they've just got to make sure their information is up to date. The next one is structural steel framing. So in the past, it was very generic because some might say that bent steel is bent steel. So it would say provide SFS. We would do this as a business. Now we don't. Now we would say it has to be not necessarily METSEC as such, but we need to say it needs to be a specific manufacturer. So we would say provide METSEC SFS. The reason being, again, it has to be tested. And we found areas where METSEC have got test results for certain scenarios that some other SFS providers haven't. So again, we would always specify SFS. So would specify METSEC SFS, not just generic. Fire protection, huge issue. And again, probably another seminar in its own right, but huge issue now that now has to all be agreed, signed off, from a design perspective by the principal designer. And that is causing lots of problems because generally designers and contractors push this responsibility down to the poor subcontractor, who generally did a good job, but ultimately it's down to the principal designer to be comfortable with that. And then certainly last but not least is the climate emergency. This is impacting on all of our projects now. It's a far bigger issue. It's not just for those that are sort of passionate about this. It's just right across the organisation in relation to products. So why is it an issue? Well, we can see the impact. 2024 was the warmest year on record. 2023 was until 2024. So you see the implications. The temperature went above the 1.5 degrees, which is what the Paris Agreement, original Paris Agreement was all about, to maintain global warming below 1.5 degrees. So clearly we're heading above that. So it's a real concern. You can see that where the main challenges are. Actually, the UK, and again, I'll give you more data on that, but UK does really well, and we are doing really well on our carbon footprint, but my view is we should be leading by example, and because people would say, well, actually, we're not the problem, but my view is that we should be demonstrating the art of the possible. But you can see there, China and the USA are the biggest culprits, and with Donald Trump as the president, who believes global warming is fake news, that isn't going to change anytime soon. And then other things that we're all, you see the diminishing of the polar ice caps at Antarctica. So you can see the impact, and we actually see this physically, that we are seeing challenges of global warming. And then brought right up to date, last week, the Texas floods, over 100 people killed. And ultimately, the starting point of that is around the warming of the seas, increasing temperatures, increasing moisture in the atmosphere, which ultimately causes more rain. So it is all tied in. And then from us as an industry, we have a big part to play. 39% of all carbon CO2 is produced via our industry one way or another. 11% is embodied carbon, which obviously is manufacturers, and then 28% is operational carbon. So it is a big user, so that means there's a good area for us to go out and make a difference. So from an embodied carbon perspective, increasingly specifiers, architects are looking for EPDs, looking for environmental performance declarations. We want to know more about our products, where they're coming from, what their embodied carbon levels are. We now have a specialist team in the business, in our Space Architects business, that look at doing EPD and embodied carbon calculations on buildings. So we would give a client a total, and clients are specifically asking for it. So a good example at the moment is there's a new Department for Education framework out, the CF25, due to be submitted in August, and will go live in 2026, under this year, 2026. And they are asking for 55 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. Now, a lot of people, that means absolutely nothing, because they don't know what current buildings are. DFE current framework is at about 850 kilograms of CO2 per square meter. So a huge challenge. Generally, the majority of your embodied carbon is in your steel and your concrete. So they're the areas that have to be addressed, but all other products have a level of embodied carbon as well. So not only is it the environment a concern for our architects, it's also clients are addressing the same challenges. And then, as I touched upon, operational carbon, again, looking at the DFE, currently schools are using about 200 to 250 kilowatts per square metre. That's the sort of target. The current framework on the DFE, they offset with photovoltaics, so they are generally delivering net zero schools. But in the new framework, they're going to try and get that down to, well, they have to get that down to 120 kilowatts per metre squared. So again, huge challenges. So that's why performance specification around energy on construction products is so important. So just to remind you and to sum up the three things that are keeping us awake at night is fire, around the issues of risk and PI. Second one is principal designer, again around risk, but also responsibility. Now the responsibility for compliance and with all standards is ultimately on the architect, or whoever is selected as the PD, but often, and probably majority of the time, is the architect. And then the third one is around carbon and CO2. It's an increasing importance, particularly for our Generation Z colleagues who are purpose-driven. So yeah, if we get all of that right and we work together as an industry, we will be able to sleep well at night, but not just architects, I think right across the industry. you probably picked up this is an area of particular passion for me. And if you want to go on my LinkedIn account, you'll see lots of articles I've written about this sort of thing around Grenfell, around product safety, all that sort of thing. So I'm more than happy to have further discussions with anybody. We are offering presentations to our manufacturing partners to have CPDs, to have discussions. I'm more than happy to open that up. And if you'd like to drop me an email, or you've got opinions, or you disagree with some of the things I'm saying, I'd be more than happy to have a chat or talk through email. More than happy to do that. So hope you found that useful, and I'm very much open for questions. If there's anything you'd like to ask or discuss, I'm more than happy to do so. So do I need to stop sharing, Paul, do I?
If you just do that, Rob, that'd be great. Yeah, we're both back on screen now. Great presentation, Rob. Thanks for going through that. Certainly prompted quite a few questions as you were going through. So I think we've still got a few minutes, so we'll get into them. The first one, this came in just before you touched on the life of a valve and you showed it in twin view. So some of this potentially has already been covered, but it's, can you give a bit of insight or a glimpse behind the curtain at where the technology is taking us to help achieve the golden thread, which I'm saying is still more of an industry buzz phrase than in reality for every project?
Is that the golden thread's a buzz phrase? That was the...
That seems to be what the question is, yeah.
I totally agree. It's a buzz phrase, but it's a legal buzz phrase. It's actually the golden thread word is mentioned in the legislation. I mean, it came from James Judith Hackett's report as a term. It's a legal responsibility. It's not a nice to have. It basically says that the accountable person, the client, needs to have a golden thread, maintain a digital golden thread of information. So not only does the client have to have that model, so they should be asking their designers and constructors, give me some really good information about how you've designed and delivered this building. But ultimately, they've then got to keep that up to date forever. So if the design changes, they need to prove that and update it. And a good example of why that's important, if you look at Grenfell, the fire doors weren't fire doors. So the maintenance guy turns up, changes a door, doesn't realise that's a 1 hour door, needs to be on a fire closer, and is a massive part of the fire strategy. He kind of takes the door off. He puts one from B&Q with no fire rating, and if you read the Dean Apes book, you'll hear about how the smoke got through those doors and how it got into the apartment. So that's why the golden thread of information is absolutely essential.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Rob. What do you think needs to be the first priority of the building safety regulator reforms?
I think, yeah, good question. I would say, and again, if I'm looking at it from an architect's point of view, I just want really good test results that I can trust, because clearly the testing wasn't fit for purpose. So yeah, so I think if the more test certificates we get, the better. That's what, sort of from a designer, that's what's important to us.
Okay, great. So the next question, there's another 3 or 4 questions. I think we're still okay for time, so let's try and get through them so we can cover everyone's questions. So hi, Rob. Fully agree that the CCPI is a brilliant initiative and one we have been involved in as a manufacturer. However, there appears to not be a drive from the rest of the industry to actually specify these products over others. Do you see this changing in the future?
I do, and I know internally here that we like the CCPI badge. We still like the BBA. So we're looking for certification. We're looking to work with good organisations. We're looking for information. Again, I brought up with BBA, thinking it was the be all and end all, and if I had that, I was covered. I've done peer reviews for a number of organisations on projects, and I looked at the specification, and this architect had specified quite rightly certain products, but then when he went back and looked at the information was not true. So the architect's done nothing wrong. They can only rely on the information they get off the manufacturers. So yeah, I think all of that is absolutely essential, and I hope more manufacturers get involved in that, because what I like about it, you need the testification, so it doesn't change that. But what it does, it's a bit like investors and people, or that kind of thing. It's looking at you as an organisation. What are your values? What do you believe in? What are your systems? Not just about have you got great test certificates. It just says, are you a do you have the right values in organisation? Are you managing information? All that sort of, is your marketing information up to date? Is it connected with your design data, etc.? So yeah, more of that, I think. And I think it's not just a nice to have. I'm just from a manufacturers, but I'm just letting manufacturers know that this is what I'm hearing from architects, and this is what's important to them. It's not a nice to have. It's going to be an essential. And the reason being, I'm not taking the risk. As a specifier, why would I take a risk on a specification on a product that hasn't got certification? I just won't specify it. So if a manufacturer, if a constructor says to me, "Don't use METSEC," I've got something alternative, I'll say no, because I've specified METSEC, and I'm happy with that. Thank you very much. So I think it's absolutely essential for manufacturers, and it will become more and more so. And if there's any principal designers start going to prison, it'll just get even worse.
Yeah. Okay. Good segue into the next question, which is around principal designer. So should the principal designer for a building regulations, that should be from a building regulations perspective, always be an architect in your opinion? We have seen companies set up offering this role who are not architects on HRBs.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they have to be. All I'd say is, are they competent, and have they got that level of experience? Because that whole thing about you don't know what you don't know, I'm obviously going to say that architects are best placed, because an architect's in a unique position, that an architect is at every meeting, starts off talking to the client about what their needs are, is in every design team meeting, is involved in the project start to finish. So if someone else is going to be in a principal designer role, they have to be right embedded in the project. It's not something, I don't believe, that you can do by a tick box. And there are many people out there, and what they're doing is they're sending out spreadsheets. Those people, a lot of those people, and I'm not saying there's people who are not architects, are not doing a fantastic job. I'm sure some of them are. But filling in a spreadsheet doesn't manage risk in a construction project. And the whole point of the principal designer role was to make sure that somebody had overall responsibility for all risk and specification on a project. There are others that are seeing it as a commercial opportunity, and I just don't think it is. And I think they're missing the whole point of the role. So I think the architect is best placed from their experience, because an architect's role is to have an overview of all of the construction process, the design process. So, and I suspect others don't have that. But it's, at the end of the day, it's down to the accountable person, the client, to make that decision.
Great stuff. Okay, Rob. There's another couple of questions. I think we do still have time. You mentioned fire being one of the three keeping architects awake. Are you actively looking for high-performing fire-rated products, or just enough? And is it now an active consideration?
We would never look for just enough. We would look for what the best product is on the market, and that really takes away the risk. What's the safest product? What's the right product? We're not taking risks, quite simply. We're just not taking risks. So yeah, it would never do just enough. So that wouldn't be the case. And I mean, just on the professional indemnity and risk, go back in the day when I put my chief exec hat on. I am responsible for professional indemnity insurance. Back in the day, our FD would sort it out and just do a renewal. Now it's a big part of our business, and every year I not only meet our broker, I actually meet our underwriter. So I go to London twice a year, just once to give an update, and once when we're negotiating the fee. But I actually meet the underwriter, because I want them to understand what we are as a business, not just a spreadsheet, how we manage risk. So it is really important. And the second part of that, Paul, what was the second part?
Is it now an active consideration?
it always has been an active consideration, certainly for us. But it just gets. I mean, what I would say is certainly what I find now in our business, because we've raised the profile so much, our team are quite cautious with that, so it gets a lot more consideration than it did before. So the guys won't, when they're getting to a difficult specification, they'll bring in colleagues, they'll make sure it goes through the technical review. I think people are a lot more cautious. It slowed the process down for that reason, but I don't mind. I think that we should do it right. So absolutely, it is absolutely centre. Fire, anything to do with fire, just doubles the time, gets a really good look at. People are very conscious of it.
Yeah. Okay. We've got 3 more, Rob. You've certainly.
I'm happy to stay on, but if people want to jump off, I'm conscious that people have other things to do. But if anybody, unless we get cut off by the system, I'm happy to stay and answer the questions. More than happy if you want me to.
Maybe we'll wrap it up on the hour, and then we can certainly answer the questions when we send around the recording. But let's crack on. So great presentation, thank you. Where else should EPDs be published to ensure accessibility and credibility? I see you have them already on BIM Store.
Yeah, I'm bound to say a BIM Store, but that's the whole point of your of something like BIM Store, that all your information's in the same place, and it's very manufacturer specific. You need them on your website. They need to be product specific. So yeah, things on your website, as much as you'd put a technical data sheet in, you need your EPD. And the reason being, the good thing on that is that, so just for example, we use one-click LCA for our building. So we take a building, we put it into one-click LCA platform, and what the LCA platform says, okay, you've got plasterboard, tell me the embodied carbon level for that. Now I can either put a generic in, but if it's a really well-performing product, I want to put that figure in. So I'm going to specify a well-performing product. So a good example, bricks, or a good example, high embodied carbon in a brick because of how they're produced. Wienerberger produce some low carbon bricks, so we would take their EPD and use their figure in our low carbon assessment, rather than the generic one, which might be a bit higher.
Yes. Okay. So is classification something you look for, or just test reports?
It depends what I mean by classification. Definitely test reports. It'll be useful to understand a bit more about classification. We need, we do use Uniclass now. So, back in the day, I used to use cores, K10, K20. We don't use that. It's not used in our organisation because we need transparent and effectively the golden thread. So we now use Uniclass for all of our specification. And imagine that was a hard move for a lot of us who are used to using cores, but now it's all Uniclass. So that's the classification that we use, and it's statutory. It can't change.
Yeah. Okay. The final question is a bit more of a technical one around BIM Store and Revit. So it's if the product data is updated in BIM Store after the object has been imported to Revit, will it update in Revit, or will the designer need to manually update the information?
It won't do it automatically because it's a project and it'll be sitting on their server, so we can't do that. But what it does do, if a manufacturer updates their product, it will send, if I've downloaded a valve and the valve manufacturer changes the specification, it will notify me to say that the specifications change, and then the onus is on me then to go back into my model and update it. So there is an alignment of that people are informed that if specification changes.
Okay. Right. Well, that's it. That's all the questions, Rob. So just want to say thank you, everybody, for joining. Much appreciated. And as Rob said, we are offering up sessions as well. So if you're interested in having a more of a one-to-one, or us presenting to your team internally, then we're happy to do that. So yeah, thanks again. And the recording will be sent around very shortly.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for everyone coming along. Thank you.